most people don't read anymore. I find for myself, I read a lot less than I used to. There's other things that take up my time: work, video games. I read stuff online. It's not that I'm not reading, but I'm not reading books in the same way I used to. But in a lot of ways, the lack of reading, I think, is less due to other things taking precedence and more to that very few books are really appealing anymore. If we look back to some of the popular stuff, a lot of it didn't stick around. Like there was one called The Wise Man's Fear and a sequel. It was never, the third one was never finished. It was supposed to be a trilogy. And ultimately, looking back on it, it was pretty terrible. It was pretty well popularized at the time, and you'll still run into people who've read it. But beyond that, I mean, the next big books are what? Martin's Song of Ice and Fire, which again never finished. Probably never will be finished. But even that, I read the first two books of that, and I didn't find them compelling to keep reading. The only reason I read the first two was because I had them as a single volume, or actually a single Kindle file, I should say. And I think that's part of it too, is the reading on Kindle or a tablet of some kind or e-reader just isn't the same as an actual book. I read a lot on planes, and mostly I read actual books. I have a Kindle still that has books on it, of course, which is nice because it means I can take a lot more stuff with me when I travel, but I also don't read it, right? I'm not reading a ton of stuff on there. Mostly on Kindle, I'll read stuff I already know I like, because in some ways it's not as pleasant to read on the Kindle as it is paper. And some paper books are hard to read too, but some of that's like the printing isn't great, or there's the book is the wrong size for physical size. But those are other considerations that in some ways aren't really taken into account, because at least older books were lost to the financial constraints more so than anything else. I mean, that's how we got pulp, as it was cheap paper and the books were cheap. And these days books are more expensive, and most of them, in my opinion, aren't really interesting. At least they aren't grabbing me in the way they used to when I was a kid. And maybe some of that's my taste have changed, but I think a lot of it is there's a lot more mediocre books out there. Maybe it's always been that way. In some ways, I was thinking about this because the original thought was, well, if you want to reach people these days, instead of going to movies or radio or books, you go to YouTube or social media of some kind. YouTube, Twitter, Instagram. That's really how you reach people these days. So I'm just thinking about it, and a lot of movies lately have been pretty terrible, because if the way to reach people is somewhere else from movies instead of movies, right, the movies won't be as good because you won't get as good people going into that field. Not to say that there aren't still good movies being made or good books being written, but that most of them, the quality is lower. And maybe it was always that way and you just didn't see them as often, and there's better marketing these days, perhaps. But that's what got me thinking about it, was if the place to be to reach people is social media of some kind, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, any others, of course, but those are the really big ones, I think. Facebook even. And even in the early 2010s, the knots, 90s, 80s, it was movies and TV, right? People still remember big things from that. There's people who talk about Seinfeld still, Friends, movies from the early 2000s, like Iron Man, The Avengers, that sort of thing. And those had big impacts, of course, Star Wars and Star Trek, movies and TV. But if you go back prior to that, radio didn't really have quite the same impact. It was still books. I think before movies and TV really became big, and even while movies and TV were big, books were still larger. But these days, I wonder if people really read anymore. People certainly seem to write. There's, I think, more books published, partly because of the advent of self-publishing, but I think there's more books published today than there have been at any other point in history, which makes sense. But even going back to when I think people read more, because the other forms of entertainment weren't there, I think there's still more books being published today. Part of that's the ease of it, of course. The fact you can publish a book on Amazon without an editor even, or a publisher, or anything really. You can just go in there and put one up. It makes it, very easy for tons of stuff to be published. And there's no filter mechanism on it. right? Like, I'm sure there were plenty of good books that were lost because they didn't fit what the publisher was looking for. But you do get a lot more junk um, these days in a lot of things, right? There's not that filtering mechanism there anymore. I think that filtering was important. I also think that literacy is declining. Not functional literacy, like you get around in the world, although I think in some places that is also, there's also a loss there with people being separated, but there's still, text and email and stuff are still, and even social media has text on it, but there's a lot more video, which I think leads to a somewhat of a decline in that. But text and email as well, there's a base level that's still reached, but there's not many people who read more than that. I think a lot of people mostly just read what they have to get by in life. So, text messages and email, maybe. And that's about it. Maybe a menu ordering. But a lot of people don't read beyond that. And maybe there's a bigger discussion there on root causes for that. And I couldn't tell you. I think education in the US has been pretty terrible for decades, even. And I don't think more money is really the solution. I think the standards have lowered in a lot of ways. It's interesting, how that's changing. But I don't read as much anymore, and when I do read stuff, most of it's older. Not There's a few modern things I read that are fun, but I kind of know they're like popcorn. They're airplane novels, is what I call them. Something you read on the plane, and that's the only reason you're reading it is because there's nothing else to do, but it's better than doing nothing. And it's more interesting, or when you can't sleep, it's more interesting than doing nothing. So that's kind of what I refer to as airplane novels, and I read a decent number of those, but for the most part, when I read, I try to read something that's not only interesting, but also, useful, or I hate to say educational because I don't think that's quite the right word, but something educational works. Or at the very least is on a topic I'm interested in. But for the most part, fiction-wise, I don't think there's really a ton of interesting stuff for me. I think you see a lot on social media of romance, and I think part of that is just it has very good marketing. But last time I went to Barnes & Noble here in the US, they didn't have much of anything that interested me. And part of that is also books are way more expensive these days. It's no longer, you can't find books for $7.99 anymore, so I just don't read as much. I do try to read more, but I find I mostly don't. I did just recently read it wasn't The Anatomy of Storytelling by Truby, it was this other one, The Anatomy of Genre by Truby, which I didn't think was as good as The Anatomy of Storytelling. I think it might be in some ways. It's more specific, and I think in some ways it's too specific, but maybe it's not, and maybe I just need to actually finish it. I think I am on the last chapter. Yeah, so, I think there's definitely a dearth of content there, or quality content there, but I don't know what the answer is, and I think we're going to see that across other things. In this, I've mostly been talking about books, but I think it's there in movies too, and in TV. I don't think any of it's really lasting. It definitely doesn't have the same impact Friends did or Seinfeld, and maybe it will come back. But I think even The Office, as popular as it seems to be online, or Community, or Parks and Rec, I don't think they had quite the same staying power as Friends did. And I wonder if it's just there because the internet's so widespread and it's so easy to put more stuff out, that there's an almost atomization happening where there's too much content for anything to have that cultural impact. Anyway, that's all I have for this week. I will catch you next week with another video.